I know how to do time. That sounds like a simple thing, but it isn't. Doing time is a skill. It requires a specific relationship with the present moment, a discipline about not projecting forward into the days you haven't lived yet, and not dragging backward into the ones you can't change. You live in the hour you're in. You solve the problem in front of you. You don't ask what comes next until next arrives. Most people can't do this. Most people are somewhere else in their heads even when they're standing still, running toward futures that may not happen or away from pasts that can't be altered. 7 years in Harlan Correctional taught me to be exactly where I was, exactly when I was there, and nothing else. This skill, which I had considered the most useless thing the system had given me, turned out to be the thing that kept me alive. My name is Carver Bowl. I was released from Harlan Correctional 14 months before the outbreak, which means I was out long enough to know what the world was supposed to feel like, but not long enough to have stopped noticing the differences between it and the world I'd left. I was living in a halfway house in the city's East District, working a warehouse job that paid barely enough and required me to be somewhere at 6 in the morning 6 days a week, which I did without complaint because showing up when you're supposed to show up is the most basic requirement of existing in the world, and I had decided I was going to meet every basic requirement without argument. I had a parole officer named Doss who saw me every 2 weeks and asked questions with the professional skepticism of someone who had been lied to so many times that honesty registered as suspicious. I answered everything directly. I had nothing to hide and no energy for anything but directness. I had no family in the city. My mother had moved to her sister's place in another state while I was inside. My friends, such as they had been, had redistributed themselves across the landscape of other people's bad decisions. I was alone in the particular way of someone who has learned that alone is cleaner than the alternative. When the news started coming, I was in the warehouse, moving pallets. The warehouse had a radio that the floor manager kept on a country station, and the floor manager turned it to the news when things started sounding serious, and we all stood there with our forklifts and our pallet jacks listening to a voice describe something that didn't fit any framework any of us had for the world. By the time I understood what was happening, I had already made my decision. Not consciously. The decision had already been made somewhere below the thinking level, in the part of the brain that 7 years of incarceration had trained to assess environments for threat and respond before the assessment was complete. I left the warehouse. I didn't clock out. The floor manager shouted something I didn't hear because I was already through the loading dock door and moving. I went to Harlan. This requires explanation. Harlan Correctional Facility sat on 40 acres on the city's western edge, a complex of concrete and razor wire that had been decommissioned 8 months before my release, when the state consolidated its facilities and transferred the remaining population to a newer institution 40 miles north. The buildings had been emptied but not demolished. The process of deciding what to do with a decommissioned prison is apparently slow and contentious and involves more municipal committees than you would expect. And while those committees argued, Harlan sat empty. I had spent 7 years learning it. Not just the cells and the yards and the common areas that the population used, but the infrastructure behind and beneath all of that. The maintenance levels, the utility corridors, the mechanical systems. I had worked maintenance detail for 4 of my 7 years because it got me out of the block, and because I learned things on maintenance detail, and learning things was how I did time without losing my mind. I knew the water system, the backup generators, the locations of the emergency supply caches that every correctional facility maintained in case of lockdown situations. I knew which buildings were structurally sound and which ones had issues the administration had been deferring. I knew the perimeter, every inch of it, the weak points and the strong ones, the sections of fence that were solid and the sections that were maintenance problems the facility had never fully resolved. And I knew, because I had read the facility closure documents that my lawyer had obtained as part of an unrelated inquiry, that Harlan had been decommissioned with its supply inventory largely intact. A state facility in the process of bureaucratic handoff doesn't move its supplies efficiently. Canned goods in the kitchen stores, medical supplies in the infirmary, tools in the maintenance shops, fuel in the generator tanks, all of it sitting in an empty facility waiting for paperwork that moved at the speed of municipal process. When the world started ending, I drove to Harlan because Harlan was the most defensible structure I knew, and because I understood it better than any other place, and because 7 years of living inside its perimeter had given me a relationship with it that was complicated and permanent. I cut the chain on the service entrance, drove my car through, locked the gate behind me. I was home. The first week I spent alone, not entirely by choice. I wasn't ready for company, and the situation wasn't stable enough to manage it anyway. I needed to understand what I had before I could think about sharing it. The supply inventory was better than I'd hoped. The kitchen stores had been cleaned out but not emptied, and what remained was substantial. The medical supplies in the infirmary were significant. The maintenance shops had tools that could outfit a serious construction operation. The generator fuel tanks were at 60%, which at the consumption rate I was planning was many months of power. The perimeter was the critical variable. Harlan's outer fence was 12 feet of chain link topped with razor wire, which sounds impressive until you understand that chain link fence is only as good as its posts and its regular maintenance, and 8 months of vacancy had produced several sections where the posts had shifted and the tension of the wire had changed. I walked the entire perimeter on day 2 with a notepad and marked every problem section. There were 11 of them. 7 were minor, tension issues I could correct with available tools. 4 were more serious, requiring post replacement or section reconstruction. I started on the serious ones first. This is a principle I'd learned on maintenance detail: address the critical failures before the cosmetic ones, or the cosmetic ones stop mattering. I worked alone for 6 days. On the 7th day, someone found me. He came over the east fence in the section I'd already repaired, which meant he'd either been watching me work or he'd gotten lucky. I found out later it was the first. I heard him before I saw him. Not because he was loud, because I had spent 7 years developing the specific alertness of someone who needed to know when something in their environment changed, and the sound of a body moving through razor wire, even carefully, even slowly, is a sound that registers. I was across the yard when he came over. I had a length of pipe I'd been using for fence work in my hand, and I watched him drop from the fence to the ground and straighten and look around, and I assessed him the way I assessed everything in those first days. He was tall, lean in the way of someone who had been lean for a long time rather than recently reduced. Maybe 50, maybe less, with a quality to his face that suggested the years hadn't been easy or wasted. He wore clothes that were practical and unremarkable, the kind of clothes that don't tell you anything, which told me something. He had a pack on his back that rode high and tight, the way someone carries a pack when they've been carrying packs for a long time. He saw me, didn't move, didn't raise his hands, just looked at me with the calm assessment of someone who had already decided that the man holding the pipe was the person they were looking for. "That's a good repair," he said, nodding at the fence section he just climbed. I didn't answer. He looked around the yard, at the main building, at the perimeter, at the outbuildings, taking inventory with his eyes. "You're doing this alone?" he asked. "What do you want?" I said. He looked at me directly, not with aggression, and not with the careful placatory quality of someone managing a threat. With the direct assessment of a person who communicates efficiently because they've decided that efficiency is a value. "A place that can be defended," he said. "I've been looking at several options. This one is the best I've found. I'd like to help you develop it, and if I say no, then I'll move on and find somewhere else." He paused. "But you won't say no. You need more hands and you know it." He wasn't wrong. I knew it before he said it. The fence work alone was at the edge of what one person could manage, and the fence was only the beginning. "What's your name?" I asked. He considered this for a moment in a way that was brief enough to be almost unnoticeable, and noticeable enough that I didn't miss it. "Reach," he said. "That's not a name. It's what I go by." I looked at him. 7 years of reading people in a confined environment where misreading someone could cost you significantly had given me a particular quality of assessment. What I read in Reach was competence and concealment, and something else I couldn't place, a quality of a person who has been somewhere that changed them and is careful about how much of that change they show. I lowered the pipe. "You can stay tonight. We'll see." He nodded like this was the expected answer and started walking toward the main building like he'd been here before, which I noted and said nothing about. He worked. That was the first thing. He worked with the focused efficiency of someone who didn't need to be told what needed doing, who assessed the situation and identified the priority tasks and did them in the right order. By the end of the second day with him, the remaining serious fence sections were repaired, and we had moved on to the minor ones. He didn't talk much. I didn't push. We worked in the particular silence of people who have decided that the work is the primary communication, and that words are for when the work doesn't cover it. On the third evening, he sat across from me in the facility kitchen, where I'd established a living area, and ate the food I'd heated without comment, and I watched him eat, and thought about what I didn't know about him, which was most things. "Where were you before this?" I asked. "Moving," he said. "From where?" He looked at me. "Various places." I let it go. I had the instinct, sharpened by 7 years of institutional life, that pushing Reach on his history would produce less information rather than more. People who guard their past are guarding it for reasons, and the reasons matter more than the facts. What I could assess was what I could see. He knew how to do physical work and how to do it efficiently. He could read a structural situation and identify problems with the eye of someone who had assessed structures before, though in what context I couldn't determine. He was cautious in ways that were not paranoid but were precise, the caution of someone who had developed specific threat responses through specific experience rather than general anxiety. And he watched the perimeter with an attention that went beyond what the current situation required. Not continuously, not obviously. But I caught him, twice in those first days, positioned at points that gave him sightlines over the outer fence, not checking the fence condition but watching the approaches, the fields and the road and the tree line beyond, as if he was watching for something specific, as if he knew what he was watching for. I noted this in the small logbook I'd started keeping. Not the elaborate documentation of the engineer in the tunnels, not the clinical records of the doctor in the hospital. Just a record of what I observed, in the plain language of someone who had learned that written records are harder to revise than memories. I'd kept a similar logbook inside. It was a habit that had served me well. Entry, Day 8. Reach watches the north tree line more than the other approaches. No explanation offered. No reason to ask yet. More people arrived in the second week. I had not advertised the facility. But a prison is a visible structure, and a prison with lights on and a repaired perimeter and the sounds of active occupation is more visible than a dark one. People in desperate situations move toward signs of organization the way water moves toward low ground. It's not a choice, it's physics. The first group was a family. A woman named Yale, her teenage son Dammy, and her elderly father who went by the name Paps and who moved slowly and said little, but observed everything with the bright, sharp eyes of someone whose body had slowed while the mind had not. They had been sheltering in their car 2 miles from the facility and had seen the lights. I almost turned them away. I want to be honest about this. The instinct to close the gate, to keep the resource pool small and the variables manageable, is an instinct I recognized from inside. A closed community is a controllable community. Openness is risk. But I thought about what the facility was, what it had been. And I thought about whether I was going to run it the same way it had been run, which was one way to survive, or differently, which was another. I opened the gate. The day after Yale's family arrived, 4 more people came, then 3 more. Then a man alone who said he was a former soldier and whose name was Hetch, and who assessed the facility's defensive potential before he asked where he could put his pack, which I found both useful and telling. By the end of the second week, there were 17 people inside Harlan's perimeter. I called a meeting, not because I wanted to be in charge, exactly, but because someone had to establish the structure before the absence of structure established itself, which it would, and what structure absence establishes is never the structure you choose. I stood in the facility's main common room, which I'd cleaned and lit with generator power, and looked at the 17 people who had come to a decommissioned prison for safety, and I said what needed saying. This place can sustain us, I said. It's defensible, it has water, it has power and food stores and medical supplies, but none of that matters if we can't function together. So here's how this works. Everybody contributes. Everybody has a role. Decisions that affect everyone get made by everyone. Decisions about security and operations get made by me, because I know this facility, and because that's what I'm offering in exchange for having found it and prepared it. If you don't accept that, the gate is there. Nobody left. Reach stood at the back of the room during this speech and said nothing and watched the assembled people with the particular attention he brought to everything. And when our eyes met, he gave me a small nod that was almost imperceptible and that I understood as something like approval, which I filed away and thought about later. The threat came from the north. It always came from the north, which was why Reach watched the north tree line. I didn't know this yet. I learned it in pieces, the way you learn most important things, from evidence that accumulated before the pattern was visible. The first piece was a vehicle track in the mud outside the north fence on day 15. Not infected, who didn't drive. A tire track from something large. I measured it and noted it in the logbook and said nothing to the group. The second piece was a reflection from the tree line on day 17. Sunlight off glass or metal, brief and possibly coincidental. I noted it. The third piece was what Paps told me on day 19. He found me doing the morning perimeter check, which I did alone and which took 40 minutes if I moved at the pace the assessment required. He fell into step beside me without asking, which I permitted because Paps had the quality of someone whose presence was rarely accidental. We walked half the perimeter in silence. Then he said, in the careful, deliberate voice of someone who has decided that saying a thing slowly is not the same as saying it reluctantly, "There are men in the tree line at night. I've seen them twice. I don't sleep well, and I sit at the north block window when I can't sleep. 2 nights ago, 3 of them. Last night too. I kept walking. How long do they stay? An hour, perhaps. They watch and they leave." He paused. "They're counting us. I think they've been counting since before some of us arrived." I thought about the tire track, the reflection, the particular quality of Reach's attention to the north. I said, "Thank you for telling me." He nodded and peeled off at the next junction, and I continued the perimeter check alone with a new set of calculations running in my head. That evening I told Reach what Paps had said. I told him directly, watching his face, and his face gave me something. Not surprise. The absence of surprise, which is different and louder. "You knew," I said. "I suspected," he said. "How?" He was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of someone deciding how much to say. "I've encountered this group before," he said. "Or a group operating the same way. They scout a location, they count the population, they assess the defenses. Then they come in numbers that exceed the defenses, and they take everything, and they move on to the next location." I looked at him. "You've been waiting for them. I've been preparing for them." He met my eyes, which is why I came here. This facility is the best defensive position I've found. If I'm going to make a stand, this is where to make it. I thought about the things I didn't know about Reach, the name he used instead of his name, the careful way he carried his history, the way he'd found the facility and come over the fence and offered himself as a resource with the precision of someone executing a plan. "How many of them?" I asked. "Last time," he said carefully, 40, approximately. They'll come when they think they know our numbers and believe they have sufficient advantage. We have 17 people. 18, he said. He let that sit for a moment. The question is what 17 of them can do when they understand what's coming. I called a second meeting, harder than the first. The first meeting had been about structure in the abstract. This one was about a specific threat with a specific timeline and specific consequences, and the people in that common room had varying capacities for processing that kind of information. Yell went very still in the way of someone who has already survived things and knows how to receive bad news. "Dammy," Her son, who was 16 and had the coiled energy of someone who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of the right things, leaned forward. Hetch, the former soldier, had the expression of someone who had been waiting for the situation to become the kind of situation he understood. Pap sat in the corner and watched everyone else. I told them what I knew. What Reach had told me. What the tracks and the reflection and the watchers in the tree line meant when you put them together. I was precise about the things I knew and explicit about the things I didn't. Because a group making decisions based on incomplete information they don't know is incomplete is more dangerous than a group that knows the gaps. What do we do? Yale asked. Reach stepped forward from the wall where he'd been standing. He laid a hand-drawn map on the table. The facility layout rendered with the accuracy of someone who had studied it carefully, with annotations I hadn't made and couldn't account for. The perimeter is our primary asset, he said. We have 3 layers of defense available if we use the facility correctly. The outer fence, which is restored and solid, the inner yard, which gives us open ground with clear sightlines, and the main building, which is reinforced concrete construction and effectively impenetrable to anything short of heavy equipment. He walked them through it, entry points and how to secure them, defensive positions and who should occupy them, communication signals and fallback protocols. He spoke with the clarity of someone who had planned this before he walked through our gate, which he had, and which the group couldn't know because I hadn't told them. I watched the group watch him, watched them absorb the plan and the confidence with which it was delivered, and make the decision that groups make when someone presents a credible plan in a crisis, which is the decision to trust it because the alternative is to have no plan, and no plan is worse. When he finished, Hetch said, "You've done this before." Reach looked at him. "Yes." Hetch nodded slowly. "Where?" The question sat in the room. Reach met Hetch's eyes and held them and said, "Other places." "Before here." Hetch looked at me. I gave him nothing back. I had made my own decision about Reach, and it was not based on his history, which I didn't know, but on his behavior, which I did. "All right," Hetch said finally. "Walk me through the positions again." The preparation took 4 days. Reach ran it. Not in the way of someone claiming authority, but in the way of someone with a specific set of knowledge applying it efficiently, which is different and which the group responded to differently. He didn't tell people what to do so much as show them what the situation required and let them conclude what their role in meeting it was. Hetch handled the weapons inventory and the training. We had what the facility had left behind in the security offices and what people had brought in, which was less than ideal but more than nothing. He was methodical and patient about it, the patience of someone who had trained people under worse conditions. Yale organized the interior. She had the organizational instinct of someone who had run a household and a business and understood that the infrastructure of a defended position was not just its walls but its ability to sustain the people inside them. She set up a food and water system that could function without power if necessary. She organized the medical supplies. She created a space in the most protected interior section for PAPs and the 2 other elderly members of the group who couldn't participate in active defense. Dami worked alongside Reach on the perimeter fortifications, absorbing everything with the intensity of someone who has found, in a catastrophe, the thing they are made for. I watched him and thought about who he would be in a year if we survived this, which was the kind of forward thinking I normally didn't permit myself and which I allowed because some futures are worth projecting toward. And Reach. I watched him constantly in those 4 days. Watched him work and teach and plan. Watched him at the north fence in the evenings, looking at the tree line. Watched him in the quiet moments when he didn't know I was watching, which revealed more than the moments when he did. What I saw was a man who was doing something he had done before, not the specific tasks, the specific quality of being in a place under threat and making it defensible, the muscle memory of it. The way he moved through the facility and assessed it was the way someone moves through a space they have defended before, somewhere else, and are defending again. On the 3rd evening of preparation, I sat with him on the steps of the main building after the group had gone inside for the night. "Tell me who you are," I said. He looked at the yard. The lights we'd set up, the positions we'd prepared, the shadows of the facility rising around us. "Does it matter?" he said. "To me it does." He was quiet for a long time. The tree line was dark beyond the fence. "Whatever was in, it wasn't visible tonight. I was in federal law enforcement," he said, "for 12 years. Before that, military. I left the law enforcement work 18 months ago, which means I left it before the outbreak, which means I left it for reasons that have nothing to do with what's happening now, but that I'm not going to explain because they're mine." He paused. "What I will tell you is that the group you're dealing with, the one in the tree line, I know who they are. Not personally, operationally. I've been tracking their patterns since the second week after the outbreak. They move systematically. They've taken at least 7 locations I know of and probably more I don't. They're not random raiders. They're organized and they're effective, and they understand that the best resource in this world is a resource someone else has already consolidated. Why didn't you just tell me this from the start?" I asked. "Because people react to the source of information, not just the information. If I'd walked in here on day 3 and told you I was former federal law enforcement tracking a raider group, you'd have made decisions about me based on what I was rather than what I could do." He looked at me. "You've been in prison. The information would have landed differently. I thought about this." He wasn't wrong. "And now," I said, "now you've watched me work for 2 weeks and you've made your own assessment." He almost smiled. "I find that the more reliable process." I sat with that for a while. The yard was quiet. The generator hummed behind us. "The group in the tree line," I said. "Do they know about you?" A pause that was just long enough. "Some of them might," he said. "I've had encounters with their advanced elements before. It's possible I'm a factor in their calculation. So you brought them here?" He looked at me directly. "I brought myself here because this is the best defensive position in the region, and I intended to defend it. Whether they follow me or find you independently, the result is the same. They're coming. The question is whether you're ready." I stood up, looked at the facility around me. The walls I knew every inch of. The systems I'd maintained for 4 years from the inside. The perimeter I'd spent 2 weeks restoring to something that could hold. "You should have told me everything on day 1, I said. He nodded. "You're right. I made a calculation and I may have made it wrong. I'm telling you now." I went inside. I didn't tell him he was forgiven because that wasn't the point. The point was that we had 3 days until whatever was coming came, and forgiveness was a thing for after. They came on a Thursday. I knew it was Thursday because I had been keeping careful track of the days, the way you keep track when time is the only thing between you and what's coming. They came at 4 in the morning, which is the hour that military and law enforcement and people who have learned from both choose for operations, because it is the deepest point of human circadian rhythm, the hour when the body most wants to be unconscious and the mind is slowest to accelerate. Reach had predicted 4 in the morning. He had been precise about it. I was awake. Everyone in a defensive role was awake, which had required discipline over the preceding days, adjusting sleep schedules, resting in shifts. Hetch had managed this with the efficiency of someone who understood that a sleepy defense was no defense. I was at the north fence section, which was where I'd put myself because the north was the primary approach, and because I needed to be at the point of first contact. Reach was 20 meters to my right. Hetch was at the east corner. 3 others were positioned along the fence at intervals Reach had specified. The rest of the group was in the main building, locked down. Yale had the interior organized with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. They would hear what happened in the yard. They would not see it unless it came to them. It was very dark. The lights we'd set up illuminated the inner yard, but we darkened the outer perimeter deliberately, a decision Reach had made and that I'd agreed with. You defend from darkness toward light, not the other way. I heard them at 3:58, not loud. The sound of a group moving with discipline across open ground, the particular compression of sound that comes from people who know how to move quietly and are doing so. The fence line was 60 meters from the tree line across an open field, and they had crossed most of that distance before I heard them, which told me they were good. There were more than 40. I counted as best I could in the dark, the shapes moving toward the fence. 50 perhaps more. They had equipment for the fence, cutting tools, and they were moving toward 3 points simultaneously, which meant they had done enough reconnaissance to identify our weakest sections, which were not our weakest sections because we had reinforced every section and had put specific preparation into the points that looked weak from outside. The first team hit the fence at the northwest corner. The cutting tools went into the chain link, which had been replaced in that section with heavier gauge material that the tools weren't rated for. It would slow them, not stop them, slow them. The second team hit the northeast corner. Same result. The third team hit the north center section, which was where Reach and I were, and they hit it with more people and more equipment, which told me it was their primary entry point, which meant they had done enough reconnaissance to identify it as the strongest section and had allocated accordingly, which was the right tactical decision. What they hadn't accounted for was the third rail section we'd run along the inside of the fence at that point. Not the actual third rail, which carried lethal current, a section of standard electrical cable connected to the generator, grounded on both sides. That would deliver a significant shock to anything that touched the fence from outside at that section. Reach had designed this. It was elegant and ruthless and effective. The first person to touch the center fence section at 4 in the morning got enough current to take them off their feet and off the fence and into the person behind them. The second person got a lesser shock from contact with the first. The confusion this produced in the primary entry team was audible and significant, and bought exactly the time Reach had calculated it would buy. I was already moving, not toward the fence, along it, toward the northwest corner where the first cutting team was making progress. Reach went northeast. This was the plan. Hetch held the main position and managed the communication signals that told the interior what was happening. What followed was 40 minutes that I am not going to describe in detail, because detail serves nothing here. What matters is the architecture of it, the way the preparation held, the way the facility did what a facility with 12 feet of fence and reinforced concrete buildings and people who knew every inch of it was supposed to do. The cutting teams got through the fence at both corner points. They got into the outer yard. They did not get into the inner yard, because the inner yard had been prepared with the specific intention of being a place where the advantage shifted entirely to the defenders. 3 of ours were injured, none critically, because Yale had a medical station ready, and because the injuries that occur in defended positions tend to be the kind that can be treated. Of theirs, I don't know the full count. What I know is that at 4:10:38 in the morning, the sounds from outside the perimeter changed from the sounds of an offensive operation to the sounds of a withdrawal, and by 5:15 it was quiet. I sat against the fence in the grey pre-dawn and let my hands shake, which they needed to do, and then I made them stop, which they also needed to do. Reach sat down beside me. He had a cut along his forearm that he hadn't mentioned and that I noticed. "That's going to need cleaning," I said. He looked at it. Yes, we sat in silence for a while. The facility was quiet around us. From the main building I could hear movement, the careful, organized movement of people who had been told to stay put and were staying put until they were told otherwise. "Will they come back?" I asked. Reach thought about this. "Not immediately. We cost them something tonight. They'll reassess. But eventually," he looked at the tree line, still dark in the pre-dawn. "Groups like this don't stop because they fail once. They stop because the calculation changes, because the cost of taking a target exceeds the value of what they'd gain." "How do we change the calculation?" He was quiet for a long moment. "You make this place something more than a target. You make it something that matters to enough people that attacking it has consequences beyond just the defenders inside it." I looked at the facility around me. The walls I'd spent 7 years hating and 2 weeks rebuilding. The people sleeping inside it who had come here because it was the safest place they could find. "A community?" I said. He nodded. "A community with walls, which is the oldest thing humans have built." I stood up. My legs were unsteady in the way legs are unsteady after extended adrenaline, which passes. I looked at Reach, still sitting against the fence, looking at the tree line. Tell me your real name, I said. He looked up at me. After a moment, he said Marcus. I extended my hand. He looked at it and then shook it, the deliberate handshake of two people formalizing something. I'm going to go check on the group, I said. And then we're going to talk about what comes next. He nodded. I'll be in. The weeks after were different from the weeks before. Not easier, in some ways harder, because the threat that had been theoretical was now concrete and the people inside the facility had experienced it directly and were living with what that experience had deposited in them. Fear, when it has been confirmed rather than anticipated, sits differently in the body. It requires management that anticipatory fear doesn't. Yale managed most of this. She had a quality I came to think of as practical compassion, the ability to acknowledge what people were feeling without allowing the feeling to override the functioning. She talked to people. She organized activities that were ostensibly practical and were also therapeutic, the work of building things together being the oldest therapy there is. Dammy had changed. The boy who had leaned forward in the first threat briefing with untempered energy had come through the night of the attack and emerged on the other side of it with something steadier in him. Not harder, steadier. He worked with Hetch on the defensive improvements we were making, and what I saw between them was the transfer of knowledge between someone who had it and someone who was ready for it. Paps sat with me in the evenings sometimes. He didn't say much. He watched the yard and drank the terrible coffee we made from the institutional stores and occasionally said something that landed precisely on a thing I'd been thinking about without realizing I'd been thinking about it. One evening he said, "You know what the difference is between a prison and a fortress?" I looked at him. "Who decides to be inside?" he said. "That's all. Same walls, same gates, different relationship to the choice." I thought about this for a long time. Marcus, which is what I called him now, worked on the facility's longer-term defensive infrastructure. He had knowledge I didn't have and applied it without being asked, which was the quality I'd come to understand was his most consistent one. He never waited to be directed toward a problem. He saw it and solved it. His history was still mostly closed to me. He had told me enough that night at the fence to give me a framework, and I hadn't pushed for more. There was something in his past that had separated him from the law enforcement work, something that wasn't a clean departure, and whatever it was had given him the quality I'd noticed from the first day, the quality of a person who is being careful about what they show. I decided it didn't matter, or rather, I decided that it mattered and that I was choosing to accept it without understanding it, which is different and harder and more honest. You don't get to know everything about the people you work with. You work with what you can see. The rest is faith, which is a word I hadn't used in a long time and was using more now. On day 60, one Marcus told me something. We were doing the evening perimeter check together, which had become a routine. He stopped at the north fence section and looked at the tree line. "They came back 2 nights ago," he said. "Just one vehicle watching. They left after an hour." I looked at him. "You saw this?" "I was watching. You've been on watch every night." "Most nights." I thought about the cut that had needed cleaning, the circles under his eyes that I'd attributed to the general exhaustion of the situation. "Why didn't you tell me?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I wasn't sure what I was seeing. I wanted to be certain before I brought it to the group. And now, they're watching," he said. "But the nature of the watching has changed. Before the attack, it was operational reconnaissance. Now it's something else. They're trying to understand what they're dealing with. What are we dealing with?" He looked at the facility, the lit windows, the repaired fence, the guard positions Hetch had established. "Something they haven't encountered before," he said. "A location that fought back, and that's still functioning. That's unusual enough that they're trying to understand it before they decide what to do next." I looked at the facility too. From the outside, in the dark, it looked like what it had been. A correctional facility, walls and wire and institutional buildings. From the inside it looked completely different. "We need more people," I said. Marcus nodded. "We need to be something that's worth the risk of joining. Not just a defended position, a reason." The next morning I walked to the gate and opened it and put a sign on the outside of the fence, not elaborate. Plain language, the kind I understood and that other people in difficult circumstances would understand. It said, "This facility is operational. Medical care available. Food and water. If you need safety, come to the gate." Pap saw me do it from the yard and watched me walk back and said nothing until I was almost past him, and then he said good. I nodded, went to do the morning work. The gate was open. The sign was on the fence. Whatever came through it, we would manage. That was the principle. That had always been the principle. From the first day, I cut the chain on the service entrance and drove through and locked the gate and called this place home. You work with what you have. You solve the problem in front of you. You don't ask what comes next until next arrives. I knew how to do time. Now I was learning how to do something harder, how to do the future.